Hi, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm Annette. I am the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at Department for Transport, but I have only been that for the last 7 weeks or so. So today will be a test of whether I am on top of my brief, as they say in the civil service. But before that, I was, for the last 5 years, Head of Innovation at National Highways, so at least the transport and road sector should be somewhat familiar to me. I hope there aren't too many sore heads in here, either from the bulge of new ideas that you all got yesterday or for the good time that was had last night. But really, networking and having a good time is what it's all about, because it really is that knowledge share across organisations that are here today that are spread across the UK. And this is the opportunity to come together and share that. So I hope that I'll be able to give you a little bit of an insight into the sort of overarching approach to transport technology within Department for Transport, both what we're doing now and what we're thinking about next. So obviously, we know we work in transport. It's a huge challenge, and that we're in a sector that has changed dramatically over the last sort of 120 years. Throughout the 20th century, we were very much in an area of empowering individual users. So thinking about personal mobility, personal private mobility, if we think about the mid-20th century and the use of cars. And really all the way through that period, transport has got cheaper, it has got more accessible. And then, turn of the century with low-cost air flights and so forth. But the challenges are that we now have an infrastructure that is over 100 years old in many cases. We've built that personal mobility at a cost to the environment, we now realise, based on ubiquitous carbon-heavy fuels. So the challenge is really, how do we tackle those environmental challenges whilst also thinking about the fact that people and the economy are at the heart of the transport network, and we need to be able to keep people moving, keep Britain moving, whilst also not impacting on the environment. And of course, now we're moving into an area that is much more complex in terms of the types of mobility, types of fuel, types of vehicle, and so forth. So my real premise with this talk is that transport is technology. It always was, from the Romans building the first roads through to the first vehicles and so forth. Transport is a system. It is the users of the transport network, it's the vehicles, it's the infrastructure, and it's the network operators, and that whole supply chain and ecosystem that sits behind it. And that's why the technology, the digital side of things, is just as important as the physical infrastructure. And I think, the talk from Darren and colleagues, and particularly thinking about some of the security aspects as well, just show you how integrated technology is to the physical infrastructure. So let's look at some of the ways in which technology really supports transport. So thinking about our construction and operations of infrastructure, the schematic here shows a connected site where we are, doing a big civils project, but we are thinking about how are we monitoring that site? How are we using connected and autonomous construction plans to drive safety, perhaps through geofencing or from autonomy, removing people from the workplace? And you can see there in the bottom left of this slide, this is people operating excavators, potentially on the other side of the world, from a warm office. And it's not just a gimmick, it's real, and it's really there to think about how do we resolve some of the challenges that we're seeing in the workforce of the future, and how do we make construction activity safer and more attractive to a more diverse workforce. So obviously a lot of technology out there now has transformed our experience of users. We all want to be able to know exactly where our delivery is, when it's arriving. That's just become kind of taken for granted now. My teenage kids are on school strike today, so I will be checking the Find My app on my iPhone later to know exactly where they are and what they're doing. the example of City Mapper here in the middle. Now, we've all had the experience. I'm old enough to remember heading out to cities, whether in the UK or abroad, and it's such a challenge to try to navigate the transport network and to think about, maybe you had to go and buy a rough guide, and you had to go to the tourist information office if your first stop to figure out the timetables and the tram network and what have you. And actually now, again, this is one of those areas that we almost take for granted, that we can find all that information online and we can rehearse our journeys before we visit. And that's really having the benefit of making public transport especially more accessible to a wider range of people that feel confident to use it. And then we've got the example here again of people using virtual reality to be able to walk through journeys before they actually take them. The example here was used during the pandemic to think about how would a train journey be safe and kind of secure from a health perspective. Or if you're a disabled user, can you think through your journey before you actually take it? So technology to learn and to plan, of course, there is so much data that is being generated now, mainly by users and vehicles, to be honest, but also by our own transport networks. So the blue map that you can see there is a map of connectivity for people going to work via public transport. And the map on the right shows journeys by car to places of education. So what this is really showing is almost a map in real time of how people are moving through the transport network, how they're using it, what modes they're using, and so forth. We're all familiar in other sectors with going into kind of large supermarkets and they collect all the data about what we buy. If you've got a store card or a loyalty card, they're collecting data about you as a person and an individual about what your use patterns are. And the graph there, you probably can't see the numbers or the labels on it, but to be honest, I think everybody will know what that is, and that is usage of the transport network during the pandemic years. So this was very much a marker for, are people adhering to lockdowns? Are they feeling more confident to get out and about again? How is the economy being impacted? Because transport is often a kind of crude marker for the economy during the various lockdowns and various restrictions that we had during that period. And then as we move into a new era of connected and autonomous vehicles, and we start to see some of the layers of that technology coming through, it's incredibly important that we collect usage data of that and that we really understand how those vehicles are performing in order to ensure safety and to drive the next range of developments and to inspire public confidence as well. And then thinking about technology to support delivery. So whether we personally are kind of petrol heads or train spotters, we are all here because we work on the transport network one way or another. And actually there's a lot that's within the industry that in some ways is still, even comparison to manufacturing and retail, quite archaic really. There's still a lot of paper-based systems out there and so forth. But actually I think this is kind of management of our transport systems is actually one of the areas that most easily lends itself to new technology. And the examples on here are drawn from, or several of them are drawn from kind of UK-based startups and cutting-edge enterprises that HS2 have used in their innovation accelerator. And it was interesting what was said about working with small businesses and so forth and startups, because actually this is bringing in a new generation of businesses into transport operations. And whether there are definitely some risks and some things we need to play through in working with smaller businesses, but actually they can also bring a huge amount of creativity. And I think one of the critical aspects of that is how those businesses are integrated with our existing supply chains. So thinking about kind of what's the Department for Transport doing now and what is next in terms of transport for technology. So as I said, we're seeing very much transport as a system, and my role in particular is around looking at the science, the innovation and technology across the Department for Transport. We don't do it all, of course. There's modal teams within the department that look after a lot of those research programs. But within my area, that's very much giving the oversight of how science is done, and are we having the right coverage in terms of looking at new and emerging technologies, for example. So last week we published our new areas of research interest. So if you want to Google DFT areas of research interest, you'll see, if you can't read all of the text on here, then it will take you to the document with all of the detail. But we often get asked by universities, by suppliers, by other partners, what is it the department is really interested in knowing? What are the problems you have? What are you scratching your heads about and struggling with? Because a lot of the investment that goes into universities, the research and science sectors, they want that confidence that they're working on the things that are important. So the areas of research interest document is an opportunity really for the department to set out that list of problems. We're not necessarily investing in all of them all of the time, but it's really to say these are the things, the questions we're asking. So, and we set these against the 4 strategic priorities for the department. So thinking about users, for example, how do we improve user experience across the network? Thinking about those people as individuals. Just recently, there was a piece of work that came out internally around transport personas. So it's very easy to think about the people that use transport networks en masse as, this big horde of amorphous people. But we all know they're individuals just like you and I, and we've all got different preferences and different things we're worried about, different risk tolerances, for example. And so what these transport personas do is really kind of put those sort of generic types of people that might be using the network into individuals with characters and names, because that really helps us to think about, the user from that perspective. We need to think about safety in operation, but also kind of security and resilience. So there's a lot of work that goes on. I was talking to the Met Office last week, for example, about how their work leads into kind of climate projections, which can help infrastructure owners to make decisions about where they should be intervening in their networks in the future. And also that kind of real-time resilience as well about, where are networks at risk currently from critical kind of incidents due to weather. Thinking about the environment, of course, and some of the challenges here are around really the systems that need to change. So as I said at the start, we've got a transport system that's based on ubiquitous fuels that are cheap. And we all know that particularly some of the heavy transport like aviation, shipping, HGVs, it's a real struggle for them to think about what is the alternative to kind of petrol-based products. And that is a real kind of international kind of system level problem that, there's no good to the US having a predominance of one kind of fuel if the transatlantic flights can't refuel when they get to the UK. So there's a lot that goes on around that. And of course, it's not just about carbon, it's about air quality, which is a really knotty problem. I know many of you will be scratching your heads about because it's a real struggle to manage. And biodiversity. Again, growing and levelling up the economy. So this is thinking about, again, coarsely, we always think about transport investment equals growth in the economy. But in these kind of more fiscally constrained times, we actually need to be really more nuanced and more targeted about where we're making transport investment, and particularly thinking about levelling up areas of the country where that really need to see that economic impact. So it's how do you target those investments? We also have R&D targets actually about levelling up and spreading research investment across the UK. And things like Adept Live Labs 2 is a really good example of where we've been able to invest in a kind of place-based innovation and research. And then finally, there's having a global impact. So I was talking to some colleagues from TRL the other day, and they're telling me about how they're working with Commonwealth countries and developing countries and their transport networks. And actually, we've got more than I thought to learn from them, because they haven't perhaps got the legacy systems that we've had in the UK and in the West. And they're able actually to kind of leapfrog a few generations in transport technology and move straight to kind of more cutting edge approaches. So that's actually giving us something to learn from. But it's also, of course, about exporting the brilliant creativity and innovation that we have in the UK. DFT also very recently launched its transport data strategy. So again, this is really thinking about that data is being generated all the time from the networks, from the users, from the vehicles, and there's a huge value on this. So, and I think one of the approaches here is really about making that data open. So much as we have a lot of good ideas in government, I think we all kind of recognise that we're not always best placed to really exploit the possibilities from data. So Transport for London making their 80 data streams open to kind of app developers and so forth is estimated to be generating around £14 million per year of economic benefit to the UK. So there's a lot for us to gain about releasing the data. But as they say in the Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility. And so if we're releasing that data, then there is a responsibility on us to think about, is that data accurate? And I mean, I think there's a double-edged sword here, actually, because, you know, yes, that data needs to be accurate if it is to be used appropriately and it is to draw benefit. Sometimes I think we're a little nervous about allowing maybe our partners in the sector to see data before we're fully confident about it. So perhaps there's something around being clear about confidence levels, but allowing still people to be in there and other minds to come in and be creative with that. There's also, of course, you know, very much we need to be cognizant of privacy and governance over our data, absolutely, because one of the things that I marvel about daily is the amount of data that we generate personally, that we ship off through my watch, through my phone, and everything else to sort of big American corporates. But actually the public perception is that because they're getting some value from that, often they're quite happy to do it, or maybe they just don't even really know. But when governments start collecting data and using it, that attracts, rightly, I think, a lot more attention about how we're doing that. So we need to be very clear about security, we need to be very clear about privacy, appropriate use, and we need to be thinking about the ethics of the data that we're using as well. So how do we make sure that we are not kind of using data that's kind of got assumptions built in about how things are in the here and now, which might be prejudicing decisions that we might want to make for a different future. So broadly, the approach by which we're kind of looking at this is thinking about how does transport research and science help what we do now, but how does it help us plan for the future as well? And the future is an uncertain place, and my team, in conjunction with the analysis team in DFT, co-own the future's risk. So that is up there on the DFT risk register, to think about what does the future look like? Where might trends take us? How do those trends move? Are they kind of steady trends, perhaps something like uptake of EVs, which is kind of largely on a trajectory that's reasonably easy to understand, together with things like AI, where, actually technology and the landscape we're in might pivot really quite quickly in ways we didn't expect. So we have a team looking at emerging technologies in this space, and we are just working on currently our transport AI strategy. And the government has just announced investment, £100 million investment, to which DFT contributed into an AI task force, which is looking at how can the UK have its own foundation language models? So, the models by which things like ChatGPT, which we all heard about, are built. There's a lot of fear about AI, and I think one of the things that's really important for us to do is to actually, within our sector, have a better understanding of what AI is and what it does and how we use it. Because, I mean, only yesterday there was a news story about being fearful about AI developing its own consciousness, that people who are working in AI should have consciousness training and so forth. But the reality is, we're all using AI. It's in our phones. Whenever you text somebody and you see that predictive text come up, that's all ChatGPT is, except it's using the whole internet to help you. But it's true, there are areas in which AI is developing that, we need to be very, very careful about. And then just finally, looking at some of the areas in which we are kind of actually working on that transport innovation ecosystem. So we've got partnerships on the Aviation Impact Accelerator. That's something that was quite new to me coming in from highways, but from everything I've seen in the last 2 months, there is really, really good collaboration across the academic sector, across business, in order to really work to understand how do we decarbonise innovation and how do we look at new forms of flight as well and work with the regulators on that. We're looking at investment in academic research through UKRI, and we have the Net Zero Transport for a Resilient Future. We get that out. Research Hub, which is going through the process now of having attracted bids and looking at the bids for that. And that's really, I think, going to strengthen the relationship between the department and the academic sector. And HS2 actually are looking at the potential for using venture models in supporting innovation, something that the government hasn't traditionally done a lot of, but how do we actually link far more closely with the sector we don't have a lot to do within transport to actually leverage and unlock investment in innovation in those places. We're looking at working with charities in the third sector to understand, some of the more detailed use cases for more inclusive transport. And then, of course, there's the Adept Life Loves programme, which I was fortunate enough to be a judge on, which I think is an extremely exciting way of working with local authorities to improve decarbonisation. And so that's it. I hope that's given you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of everything we're kind of thinking about, and I shall be looking at DFT colleagues to see if I've hopefully got my facts right, sort of 2 months into the job. But I hope that was enjoyable for you, and I hope that the conversations today continue to be exciting and fruitful. And I will be around for most of the day. If anyone wants to ask me questions, please feel free to come and have a chat over coffee. And thank you for listening.